Stefan, you're welcome to take a seat here. If you take one, then we'll swap in a moment. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. Welcome to what is the fifth in our Michaelmas term lecture series on inequality. I would like to begin by welcoming you all here to the Oxford Martin School. My name is Achim Steiner, recently appointed director of the Oxford Martin School. And also to just draw your attention that this lecture today is being live webcast, so you are on global record, but obviously a global audience also following a very special lecture. And it is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Professor Stefan Dercon, a professor of economic policy at the Blavatnik School of Government. He is director of the Center for the Study of African Economics, a fellow of Jesus College, and in the other 24 hours of the day that are there, also the chief economist of the Department of International Development, and that since 2011. His lecture today on inequality, poverty, and global development both builds on the theme that we have already been exploring through many different perspectives this term. I think what is quite clear is that in having chosen this theme, we have put our finger not only on some brilliant research that is happening across this university, but also across the globe, but also our finger on an increasingly bitter dispute in our societies about what living with inequality means. There will be many who this week will be rationalizing the outcome of an election of a nation on the other side of the great pond. Inequality may have a lot to do with it. It may not. And certainly some of the work that is also going on here at the university, for example, at the Institute of New Economic Thinking on growth and inequality, I think points to the fact that there are no simple stories here. But what Professor Dercon will focus on this afternoon is looking at it in the context of global developments. And clearly much of what we are, at least in a meta-narrative, seeing right now emerge on explaining what is happening to our societies, what is happening to our global community. You know, it's only a couple of decades ago that we talked about a post-Cold War era, about open societies, about open borders, about accelerated development and how poverty would be a phenomenon of the past. And here we are looking at a fairly rapidly growing shambles of at least aspirations. Poverty, inequality is certainly a key part of trying to understand what is happening before our eyes right now. And therefore we very much look forward, Stefan, to your presentation this afternoon and to a lecture that will hopefully take that global perspective also one step further. I just want to point out that the hashtag for the series today is OMS Inequality. And if any of you would like to tweet or draw the attention of your colleagues, now is the time to do so. Thank you very much and welcome again, Stefan.
Well, thank you very much, Achim. Well, good afternoon. This was an invitation I couldn't refuse, but I was also a little bit worried about it because the more I thought about it is that I don't really work on inequality, I think. And the more I thought about it, actually, I realized I probably do. And I think there's a little bit that kind of contrast and that kind of slight contradiction that I will actually want to explore a little bit today, talking about, issues to do with global development, inequality, poverty, global development issues, and how they are empirically taking shape in the developing world, but also how people think about it. And in the global development community, those who are involved in trying to think of the narratives of how and what should we do about it, how do these issues feature? It's also something that worries me a little bit, of course. I'm as a chief economist in a government department, being live streamed is a serious risk, given that I'm known not to be terribly discreet, and there will be certain moments when I will let the slide speak and not say too much, for maybe obvious reasons at that stage. But anyway, I will want to try to articulate and bring out more contrast maybe than sometimes some of the people involved have actually totally implied, but it's just actually to help us think. So, for those of you who have been following this series, or those of you who are working at all about inequality ever, or even just reading blogs and whatever, this is a graph you will have seen. This is Branko Milanovic's graph on what's been happening to growth across different percentiles, deciles of the income distribution in the world. You know, this is known as the elephant graph, and some people call it the best picture ever. Yeah, okay? And it's something, not least, you know, it will be recycled in coming days because it is being used, even though Branko has been very careful in general of how he explains it, it will have been used to actually explain some of the things that have been happening, say, in June in this country, and then yesterday or the day before in the US. Where we get actually something quite striking happening in the global income distribution, where, you know, if we rank everybody from poor to rich, this actually tells us between 1988 and 2008, the kind of income growth people have experienced. This is expressed in constant purchasing power. Let me not go into detail, but in a way that somehow allows us to compare dollars across the world. It's not a perfect way by no means, but it tells us something. And basically the story is that, yeah, maybe the poorest decile, we observe, relatively speaking, not that much income growth, but then actually it's been quite good in a lot of places. And then we have here clearly a peak here and another a point here that is really very low. Now, this red cross is what typically is referred to, well, that's roughly where the American lower middle classes were, and actually the same in Europe. And they have actually not experienced very much, while actually the top of the income distribution, especially in rich economies, they have been growing very fast. And this is essentially, there's very little here in the graph that applies to anything to OECD countries except for the last bit. And this is really the OECD, well, story of the OECD countries, where some of the poorer groups haven't really gained that much, and the richer groups apparently have been gaining an awful lot. But this one is also an interesting one, because that's actually a story that's maybe less told, but that's something that's been happening in the global income distribution. This is somehow the kind of the proper middle classes in China and to some extent in India and some of the other East Asian countries and some Asian countries. That's what's been happening as well, who've actually had an incredibly good innings during this period with very, very high income growth overall. I'll come back to that picture, because it motivates for a lot of people the way they want to talk about, you know, this is why inequality starts mattering, because look at what these guys are doing, look at what's here at the bottom, and look at what's happening in our countries. But already I want to emphasize there's a global story as well, which is a bit more messy than simply saying it's all getting worse, it's all terrible, we're going down the drain. And this is what I want to do a little bit is, you know, inequality is back. It's clearly back. The room is full here, and hopefully a few people are also listening online. But definitely, it is being discussed. It matters in politics. It matters in discourses. And I want to actually give a bit of a sense here how this relevance is at the moment in development analysis and policy narratives. So to what extent is inequality the right lens to look at some of the things that are going on? And I would actually want to argue that we have to be very careful to just jump to conclusions with very simple narratives about inequality to understand what's going on across the world. And I think it's actually quite dangerous, because I think some of the false narratives, and I'll come to that at the end, the false narratives that have been talked about and tried to use to interpret some of the phenomena, if we accept them, they're actually pretty dangerous for the poor of the world. So I will do this also using some, what I call on the slide a bit more than just the big thinkers. These are lots of people that have been actually involved in lots of debates. I don't know how many of you will recognize any of them, but I've now got Amartya Sen and Joe Stiglitz and Jeff Sachs. Paul Collier is there. Bill Easterly happens to come there. This is Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee. And then James Robinson and Daron Acemoglu. I better briefly check, but Jim, I know he's in Oxford, but he's not in the room, so that's helpful. And then actually Angus Deaton definitely deserves a place there as well. People, what they have in common, besides some of them more brilliant thinkers than others, and some of them more careful than others, but in any case, what they have in common, that they've all written bestseller books. You know, I'm not saying who are the more careful ones and who are not. But they've all written books, they've all done kind of analysis, and they all come actually, and why I've emphasized it, you know, when we get someone like a new politician becoming a minister, say, in my government department, we tell them, why don't you read these books? Jim and Daron's book, So Why Nations Fail, is the book that David Cameron said that was the one that was his favorite book, and he said it in an interview at some point. And we do know that he read, before he came to power, he read Paul Collier's book. We know that in the Blair Brown years, Jeff Sachs was read all the time by the policymakers as well, and so on and so on. And these are all people that actually help to shape the narratives in international development. These are the books, these people that work in development say, oh, better take it on holiday and have a look at it, how is it actually evolving. They shape, definitely also in my department, somehow how people are thinking about it. So what I want to do quickly is actually give you, well, hopefully a few facts, a few things that I think are quite important to focus on. This has been coming for the last half an hour, so anyway, this is helpful. So overview, a few facts on global inequality, poverty and development, and actually what do these people say about it, but also what does it mean a little bit in the way we looked at the facts and the figures of recent times. And I'm going to do this quite fast, but I'm going to actually talk here in a section that actually is talking about, you know, it is the great convergence. You know, we have a kid here on the slide, you can't quite see it, but it was so sweet because he's writing the Solow growth equation on it, and the economist here will know that Solow is the one that actually has this extremely simple growth model, which is still shaping a lot of thinking and development, which actually said that, you know, when you get a lot of capital for a fixed amount of labor, the marginal return for an extra unit of capital is going to go down. And if you have very little capital, that marginal return, the extra that you can earn from a bit of extra capital, is quite high. And it actually led to this extremely simple prediction, is that poor countries will grow faster than rich countries, because they don't have as much capital once, so a little bit extra capital allows them to grow, and actually we will converge somehow in the assumptions of that model to the same steady state and something. Now look, if there's anything that shapes what people in development seem to want to do, is actually, can we find a way of lifting up poorer countries to actually be somehow following up in the kind of living standards that richer countries get? So, now, what do the data tell us? Well, they tell us actually quite a few surprising things, and some of the things you will be very surprised by, I hope. Well, the first of all is something you probably already know. There's no such a thing as the developing world. You know, people that, you know, and I'm old enough to remember people that kept on talking about the third world, the idea of a clearly defined group of countries, indeed, that unionized themselves, I was going to say, but it's maybe not a bad term in the G77, that they put together as a kind of a group of countries in the UN, and they were saying, look, we are the developing world. No, there was such a thing as the developing world at some point. And the way I will show you is actually with this very simple picture. Well, it seems to be a lot more in it, but it's actually really, really pretty. This is Hans Rosling, brilliant man, especially on graphically representing pictures and graphs and talking about it. So wonderful YouTube videos, Hans Rosling. So he's a demographer, public health person from Sweden, but basically Gapminder is freely available on the web, and it has a lot of nice pictures. So follow me for a moment. So here, this is the colors. If you see a particular color on the graph, it refers to these continents as described here. So blue is Africa, yellow is the Americas, and so on. Then, how big is the bubble? It presents population. Now, I have probably here the simplest explanation of what is happening in development, especially in levels of human development. Actually, two indicators bring this very nicely together. One is that you well probably can imagine that tells us something about development. It's simply the quantity of life, you know, how long do you live? It tells us something about the progress in what's happening to people. It's simply the life expectancy in years. And, but I have another one here. Oops, that was a little bit too quick. I'm doing this all wrong. Apologies. No, totally wrong now. And now we're back. Here we're in the developing world. The first picture, this is 1960. And what I express here is children per woman on the x-axis. Now, why do I like this as an indicator? Not because I'm somehow a demographer obsessed with fertility. No, it's actually, in fact, I think actually fertility itself doesn't tell us an awful lot, except for it probably is some of the most useful outcome indicators of what's happening in a country. Not because lots of children is bad for poverty or something like that, but it tells us actually something because we know that we need a lot of things in place in development to bring fertility down. And in fact, the number of children per woman is typically the consequence of people countries having, or societies or families having low infant mortality, education, female empowerment, and income security. And all these things together are typically what matters to actually get fertility down. It's usually not one of the other. It's definitely not just a supply of family planning techniques, but it actually is usually, we see it in countries coming down, if something is going right in human development. So what do we get here on the picture? Well, you can see there is a developing world. There is a lot of countries with some variation in life expectancy, but definitely not very high, but with very, very high number of children per woman. And we have a group of countries here in 1960, all orange and a few yellow. Basically, it means North America and European countries, where we have high life expectancy and we have, relatively speaking, a very low number of children per woman. Now, that's 1960. That is actually what it means like to be the idea, the existence of a developing world. But this is when we look at it over time, what was happening. By 1980, the picture looks already like this. As if somehow, a lot of these countries seem to be sucked up in life expectancy, and already some seem to be turning in towards this point of attraction, which are the orange ones. We see already China by then actually moving very fast to having very low fertility. If you think back where it was, this is where China was, with extremely low life expectancy and very high number of children. Of course, this is a very bad period in China as well, great leap forward period, but how it actually managed to converge very quickly to these better outcomes. And what we see gradually is just blue countries here. These are African countries. And we see light blue, some are hanging here, but seemingly beginning to do this, because by 2000, that's what's happened already. That's 2000, and that's the latest data we have. Now, that is actually convergence. This is a lot of countries in the most basic indicators of human development. This is not very sophisticated. This is not university degrees or quality of human capital or something. But this is already something. They actually are converging to a massively better outcomes, converging all together. With, of course, the difference here, and these are countries that seem to be staying behind. They're getting closer, but they're not quite there yet. So this is actually already one thing. That is very striking. Now, do we have the same when we go into indicators of poverty? Income poverty. Something that tells us a little bit about, the livelihood people have, the incomes they can earn, maybe the social security benefit payments they can get, and so on. Now, there we will also see some progress, but much more heterogeneity. And what we'll see is Asian convergence and African divergence, where actually in the human development, Africa just seems to be staying behind, but maybe getting slowly there. It's making progress. Okay, well, where we can see this here. This is actually this kind of famous measure of poverty, the latest update, where we look at, again in constant purchasing power, can we look at the number of people that are below 1.90. Okay, this is the old dollar a day, just updated for 2011 figures. It's a bit more sophisticated than that, a little bit more complicated and also controversial than that, but still it is more or less what we have. But if we look at this series of data, by 1984 we had about 2 billion people that were classified as below that level. That's particularly high. But what we see in the progress that is being made is we see a clear decline. And in fact, by 2012, we think that we will have gone below 1 billion, okay, in this measure. But then start looking at the colors. This is what's been happening, or I seem to have, this is Africa, sorry. I don't know, somehow the labels didn't come through. But I'll show you first East Asia, which is the most striking. This is largely China, of course.
and this is China, the incredible declines that we've known in poverty reduction. This is the fastest, most extensive poverty reduction in the history of mankind that we've seen in China. Dramatic declines. We see that always, that even to start with, Latin America and Europe had very low levels of this poverty. And actually Latin America didn't really change that much, although a bit more recently it did. And this is actually largely driven by a bit better growth, a bit more inclusion, and actually social cash transfers and things like that, Bolsa Familia and things like that. But still, it never really was a big player since the 1980s anymore on the kind of poverty. And now this is South Asia. This is, of course, largely India, where it actually, the numbers, even the percentage had been going down since the mid-1980s. The levels had been going up until 2000 because population growth was still outpacing poverty reduction. And then it's actually started to go on a poverty trajectory. And in fact, the latest data in India suggests that it actually is still going down further. Now that's progress. And now we get Africa. It actually has managed to stall the increases. But even though we say Africa rising and so on, but the stock of poverty is more or less the same now. Growth rates have been good. Poverty reduction is now, though, just barely being able to keep up with population growth as well. So that's been happening with Africa. Now, but that's still, overall, that's progress. But it is actually very striking that definitely in East Asia has been this massive progress, and actually it's more or less delivered by them. We tend to say, you know, as proud development agencies, we've achieved the MDGs, but we can't add to the sentence, thank God for aid, because that's how we did it. Because, of course, it was China who probably, to the largest extent, delivered all this progress in Millennium Development Goals, and very little aid was given to China. And we see it in another way, and this is actually the convergence. It's not just in poverty levels, but it's also in average income levels. This is a picture that directly tries to show the idea of convergence. This is the GDP per capita. This is now not in PPPs, but in current dollars. There's some reasons when you start doing these pictures, you want to be careful with your time series in PPPs. So anyway, there's a more thing, but this is probably the best way of expressing it. GDP per capita in the OECD is 100%, and this gives us the percentage that each of these continents have. And this is again from 1980 always up to about 2011 that we had data in this picture. And then we see an interesting thing, of course. We see Latin America that actually had been diverging. So it actually had a smaller share of income, smaller income relative to OECD. So that percentage went down until around 2000, but managed to recover. But it hasn't even recovered ground to where it was in 1980. And now we see East Asia. Now that is convergence. Actually, historians tell me that's probably the first time since the 18th century that we see actually a group of countries moving back to where kind of the North Atlantic, Europe and Americas were actually moving in terms of their incomes. Actually, before that, we had probably been moving more or less together, but then with the early industrialization and beyond, we moved apart. This is the first time in a very short period, they've managed to actually catch up about half the trajectory and a bit more. This is not then saying, you know, it still means it's only about a quarter. So China's incomes maybe only, now it's already a little bit more, but in PPPs it's not more than, well, it's a little bit more than a third now of the purchasing power, the average incomes as a purchasing power as to the US. And I'm saying here incomes loosely, the GDP per capita, but it's quite a remarkable increase. And then South Asia, you know, we think all very fast growth there, but still, it's only slowly managing to go for having only 5% to actually now, probably it's now by now roughly at about 10%. So we doubled again. And now we see Africa, that's divergence. That's going down. We're losing them again. And it's actually flattening out a bit. Oh, there's a little bit of recovery, but it's still, you know, 6% of OECD, GDP per capita is 6% of what the OECD has. Now that's a big gap. Now that's a very, very big gap. That's that important. And what is linked to that already then in a way I've shown you, is that this is linked that actually something that is really striking at the moment. If I go back to this picture, there were times in the 2000s even, that the stock of poverty in Asia was still larger than the stock of poor people in Africa. In fact, even today, if I randomly pick a poor person, suppose I did put them all in a hat and I pick a poor person, and I ask myself, what nationality will this poor person have? What do you think the nationality of this poor person most likely will have? What is the highest probability nation that I will pick a national from the hat of all poor people? So it's India. It is India. It's India at the moment. But actually, this is now changing. And what we now get is actually, if you look at, this is actually my office in DFID, where we have this very simple projection model that seems to be extremely simple way, tracking exactly what the World Bank does in a very sophisticated way, so we just happily use it, but gives us a bit of an indication if patterns as we observe them now are continuing, this is what we be by 2030. Probably the removal of Asian absolute poverty. I'm not saying that these people will all be very wealthy, but the absolute poverty will be gone. And the rest is just African poverty at the current patterns. This is despite that actually growth had picked up in Africa, but it's actually very poor transmission of growth into poverty reduction in Africa. So that's a projection. That's not the truth, of course, but we think it will be about 5%. You know, the SDG says we want to have zero poverty. We'll probably be only halfway through. Now, it wouldn't be bad if we got there. This was probably still an optimistic scenario, but even in an optimistic scenario where you keep on with the same stock of poor people in Africa, that makes you a bit worried. And what does it mean if I now put all the poor people in 2030 in a hat? Well, it's obvious that there will be an African national. So which country you think will they come from? Try to think a little bit. So which country is most likely the poor person that you pick out of the hat then? It is going to be Nigeria, okay? Nigeria is a bit of a tricky one because we have no clue how many people there really are in Nigeria. The population figures are so bad, and they are puzzling, let's put it like this. In any case, the second country would be the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, and then it would be, you know, other countries competing for it. But that's actually a striking thing. A random poor person will most likely by 2030 be a Nigerian. That's a very different changing phase of poverty because it adds to something else as well. In all the projections that we're all working with, we also think that the poor, you know, we actually are looking here, the population, the percentage of the poor people, the extreme poor, that will actually living in fragile states. Those who don't know, this is kind of the definition people typically use, but it suggests somehow countries that are struggling with legitimacy, with authority, with even just basic services to their people, often conflict affected or with history of conflict and so on. This is what the OECD fragile states list suggests, that by 2030, it will be 85% in fragile states. Now that's a changing phase of poverty. If at the moment, or most likely, or actually even 10 years ago, it would be Asian poverty, these were not fragile countries. India, okay, it's a maybe complicated, messy place, all kinds of different directions, but this is still countries with aspects of legitimacy, of authority, and indeed of functioning state institutions. If we then go to actually totally fragile states, the ball game will be very different, or what we're actually facing with them. Actually, we have different lists, of course, other people. World Bank is extremely careful, of course, more political organization controlled by state shareholders, and nobody likes to be on the fragile state list, of course, and people lobby to be it. But even on their lists, it would be a doubling of that percentage. That's the most extreme. These are probably countries that are already in conflict, and then you can't really deny that you're fragile. Anyway, but that's actually interesting. Now, where does inequality fit into it, finally, in terms of data description? Where does that fit in it? I haven't even mentioned it. I've been giving you a picture of poverty. Of course, there are links to what happened to poverty and inequality. You know, inequality tells you about the whole distribution, and poverty is something about the bottom end of the distribution. It tells us something, but it doesn't tell us, of course, the whole story. And going back to this picture, I'm actually thinking, and I know Branko Milanovic's picture is also a bit controversial because it kind of misleads a little bit. Some people have written papers and argue very strongly it misleads an awful lot. I say it tells us, and he's never been lying to us in terms of what it tells us, but it doesn't tell us everything. And the point is actually as follows. The way this is calculated is you compare two cross-sections. Literally it means we take in 1 year, we order all the poor from rich, and now we take another year, we order all the poor from the rich. You give the impression that that poor person here is the same poor person all along, or that poor person here is the same person all along. Actually, the world is more complicated. Maybe lucky, there's something to research, there's something more to understand. But actually, it is quite a lot more. Maybe less so in this end of the distribution, because this was always the rich countries. But actually here, there's been quite a lot of movement. Or put it differently, if I have an incredibly lucky draw and I'm somewhere here, and I see my income going up by 200% or 300%, in the data, I would end up actually somewhere here, And then my growth would actually seemingly be compared to what the incomes of that percentile was at the time. Do you understand? So you actually don't really account for people moving in that direction. It's as if the only thing is happening, you're moving, somehow you have a growth there. But of course, you move position. If you have a really good growth in a country, you maybe move position, and indeed that's what's happened. And that's what's a little bit misleading about this picture. It doesn't tell us the full picture. It doesn't tell us the full picture here. Let me put it simply. I can't give you exactly all the data, but the countries that are here are typically countries that are in a mess, in an absolute mess. Now, it's not, fortunately, not always exactly the same countries that are in a total mess. So there's countries that move from here, and then very quickly they move there. I can't tell you where Syria is. It's probably still there, but Syria will have actually moved several deciles down in its averages. Actually, Syria, before the conflict, had probably had absolute poverty of $1 a day, the equivalent. That would be a few percent at most. Now, of course, after the conflict, you can imagine it will be very, very substantial. And they will move people will move much more down. Now, but the same thing is, if a country does enormously well, they will move in here. And in fact, as I will argue in a moment, or explain or show you in a moment, if this is the Chinese middle class that Branko talks about, they were actually quite different in the income distribution to start with. And that's actually what the story is. So it is the best picture in inequality, but we can still be misled a little bit. Okay, and to do this, I should explain to you about Twin Peaks. I mean, it probably dates the research that this was done in, but fortunately it's come back, so we can talk about it again. But actually it's the following. This is actually the Twin Peaks people talk about it. And this is actually and I'll give you a better picture at the moment, but this shows clearly the Twin Peaks. This is actually in GDP, incomes per capita ordered from the lowest to the highest. This is actually in PPP of 2005, just like the other year that the data is, but basically you see, this is 100, this is a very poor person here and there, and this actually gives you the frequency, gives us a sense of how likely it is that we observe people in the world income distribution of that kind of level. So this is the point that's the most likely one, but we clearly have 2 points that clearly spring out. Yeah, so it's not a cumulative distribution, it's not a growth rate like the early one. This is actually a kernel density, as we would call it. So it basically gives us that there's a lot of people, and this is in 1990 around 500, and a lot of people that are in about 5,000, okay? And that was actually the world. This is actually still the idea of a world that actually is distributed around a very low equilibrium or a low level of income, and a world that's distributed amongst a much higher one, as if there's still two worlds, developing worlds versus a rich world. That was actually in 1990. But this is actually what's been happening, and you can just see the picture shifting. Up to 2011, it's a very bad picture, I'm sorry, I couldn't get a better one today, but this is from Branko's paper, and this distribution has been moving, and rather than having twin peaks, it's actually moved to be essentially more or less smooth. And in fact, by now, when Branko calculated, again, this is from the slides that he presented here a few weeks ago, that's actually what his income distribution looks like. You have no more twin peaks. The world has actually come together as well. So it actually means there's some mass of that distribution moved inwards. And actually it's now, the point is here is about, this is in 2011, is about 2,200. And that's where the world distribution, these are the very rich people, and these are then the very poor, goes poorer. This is actually more or less where absolute poverty line is. And so we have about 10% of the world population in that end. And so then we get in the distribution 50%, that seems to be the median is around 2,100. 50% is only 2,100. Okay, what do we have here? It's about close to 30,000. Okay, so that's just little. The median person in the world has only a much smaller number, of course, but it's only a fraction, less than a tenth. And then this is then the 73 percentile is there because that actually is the global mean. And then actually this is where 91% is below what the median of Western Europe or North America and Oceania have. Now, this is actually quite interesting. If you see a distribution like this, given some conversations and debates we have, I know this very well sitting in DFID and having to defend the aid budget once in a while, and we hear then, why should we give money to poor people in developing countries? Well, relative to the median, definitely 91% are below this. Actually, but they say, no, but there's lots of poor people in Britain. So where would a poor person in Britain actually situate themselves in income distribution? Just going to let you think. Just Think of a number that you want to have. I'm not going to ask you, don't worry. But where do you think, say, a person that lives in the lowest 10th decile, or another way of putting it, that lives with income support and maybe gets housing benefits, say a couple that has these things, where would they come? So I calculate that with the IVS calculator. Branko also did it. I asked him to do it, and this is where they are. It's actually about 75 to 80% of the world population is poorer than someone in the UK living on income support and housing benefit, okay? And it's not because the benefits and income support is too high, okay? If I may clarify this here. Basically, the poorest 10% of the population in Britain is actually still, I mean, there's basically about 75% of the global population that's worse off than them. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. Okay, so why do I get that? Well, because actually because this world distribution, the fact that these twin peaks has become a single peak, actually has had quite a consequence of where all these people were, because it meant some people really moved quite a lot inwards, and that's actually what's happening, but you can't see it here because it doesn't have the data. He can't follow individuals in the world. He can't compare where people went, but we can do it at the level of countries. And that's actually quite interesting to just have a quick look. And if you take in 1990, I couldn't get 1988 for some data reason, and these are the lowest decile to the top decile, where is each country? And if you say the 10% poorest countries, that's dominated by countries like, in 1990, dominated by countries like Bangladesh, Vietnam, Ethiopia, DRC, Tanzania, Nepal. And actually China was actually in the second and the third decile, okay? But nearly 1 billion people, of course, it more or less takes on 2 deciles of the distribution. India similarly takes almost 2 deciles, and it had on the lower end is a bit of Sudan and Madagascar, and on the 5th decile, Kenya and Zimbabwe. So India was actually better off in GDP per capita in PPP terms than actually China was at the time. And then you get countries like, you can see that there, Philippines, Nigeria. And just look at these numbers, of course. A huge bunching there in the country's GDP between the first and the 5th decile. You know, that's all not very high. That's actually at most about 50, 55% more than the next one. And then you see what's happening on the richer end there. And you see these countries. It's sometimes a bit surprising. Actually, UK didn't make the top 10% richest GDPs, just at the margin. I'm from Belgium. Belgium made it, yes. Germany as well, by the way. Anyway, but of course, in the top end would be the Saudis and the UAEs and so on. But it's quite an interesting thing to actually have a look at it, because that, in a very quick and dirty way, is the Branko picture, but at the level of countries. And actually, the story is really not so much that all the growth happened for the middle classes and say, oh, leaving the poor behind. It's actually largely driven by a set of countries. This is basically China growth, kind of dramatic increases. The PPP numbers give it far higher than actually almost plausible. But even if it's too high here in the PPP numbers, it will have been definitely dramatic. And India is then the next bunch. And between the two of them, that's actually the largest growth. Well, because all the other groups have countries that did very, very well and countries that didn't do too well. So it's lower. So if you think of it, the fastest growing country in that period was not China, actually. There was a country that had a GDP per capita increase in PPP terms equivalent of 1,500%, Equatorial Guinea. We probably see it all in Paris in the houses there. But anyway, but China is then actually the next one. But then you got countries like Vietnam, where you have 300% growth, India 200%, Korea just under 200%. But then also countries, a couple of African ones, Mozambique 200%, Ethiopia 130%, and so on and so on. Ireland is the best European, 140% in that period. But these are very substantial increases. Of course, there are countries that went down, not that many. Zimbabwe managed to go a third lower in that period, but actually not that many countries got dramatically lower, at least for these data. But what does it mean? Well, if you go to this picture again, sorry, if we go back to, I thought I had it here, but if you go to Branko's picture again, there's a lot of people that were in this income part of the income distribution actually moved to the right. And actually their growth of the Chinese and Indian middle classes is far bigger than 70% in that period. Anyone who knows these places, actually the growth of the incomes of the middle classes is multiples of what they had before, 200–300%. And they moved into there. But that's actually an example. There's some of these countries, East Asian and India, largely, and to some extent Bangladesh, that was in here, also moved quite fast. Some Asian countries that moved much more to the right of the income distribution. Now, why do I talk about this? This is where it actually gets a bit messy, because But the last slide here on the kind of data, at least, will give us very quickly a bit of a sense of what's been happening. And there's actually something that people are very familiar with that study these things. Well, why don't we consider how much is due of these changes in inequality in the world? How much is actually due because caused by changes in the within-country inequalities and the between-countries inequalities? Now, of the global variation in inequality, it's something already very long time known, that it's definitely more than 75% of the global inequality. That's actually all between countries. Or put it differently, as if it's just the means between countries are very different. This is not because there's huge inequalities within. The global inequality is not driven by huge inequalities within, but 75% is it between countries, and about a quarter there. Okay, it has gone down, and that's a Branco point as well. It has come down from about the 1990, that was just over 80%. Okay? But the big story of global development is still the huge differences between countries. And actually a big part of this story of what we see in the increase in within the contribution of within-country inequality is also because, to some extent, the between-country inequality has gone down. And we actually have observed that actually countries like China moving up in the income distribution has actually led to creating the impression that actually it's the within income inequality that's increased, but actually we have to be careful. Now, it has increased. The data tell us that. It has increased, but don't think that the numbers involved, the nature of the changes are as large as sometimes people give the impression that they are. The big differences are still between countries, and then, as my data was showing, whether it's in poverty or in growth rates, it's a lot of African and fragile countries that stay behind. And for me, the biggest inequality in the world is still that. That's where we are, the between-country inequalities between a number of places, what it is. So what should we do then? And I know I'm taking a bit longer, so I'm going to rush a little bit through some of the next things I will be telling. Should we then study the inequality between countries, or is the study of inequality within countries less important? Now, that's quite interesting, because that's when I actually picked up all these books, again, from all these bestsellers, and say, okay, do they talk about inequality? So what do they say? Well, here's some of the books I picked up. There's barely any reference on inequality. Very few of these talk. Even Angus Deaton's book has inequality in the title. It's very little about inequality. And in fact, some of them, like Paul Collier's book, has 2 mentions of inequality, and it's something to do with it's not a cause of civil war. So, you know, if fragility is one of the big things, that's not the easiest correlate to actually get. Now, people talk about it, and so my argument is a little bit, they talk about it, but not in the way that we make it all about income inequalities. They do talk about the big differences between countries' development and the trajectories that they're on, and how can we actually explain it. So, I'll go quite fast on this, and, but for many of you, some of these things will be familiar, I think, and I will talk a little bit about it. What do these people then say? And actually, for me as a framework, I'm going to have 2 lenses. One is how people think about growth, and how do people think about the way the market operates and delivers poverty and inequality, yeah? Or the links between it. Now, the growth lens is clear, because if a big part of the progress in the world on poverty has been some of these countries moving up somehow as countries as a whole, and not just as just lifting up the poor, but moving up in the income distribution as countries as a whole, then clearly understanding how these countries have been moving is really important to understand what's happening to global inequality. But also, and this is where I want to start very briefly, is actually just briefly just kind of say, well, you know, if these economists that I refer to, because they were all economists, they are kind of market economists, so how would they think about inequality to start with? So a strong view is, if you read the Wall Street Journal, or maybe listen to some rhetoric of some people that got elected yesterday, market will handle it, no doubt. Market will take care anyway. I mean, fortunately, economists are not as foolish as that. You know, when we teach economics, the basic things, we know that the foundation for this thing, that this is very weak. And we usually talk about 2 things. It's welfare theorems. And actually, one of them is quite straightforward, and one that often the Wall Street Journal will repeat. If we have perfect competition, we'll get to efficiency. But for those of us who like to work about things to do with welfare issues, we like to tell them also there's another welfare theorem that already goes back to the 1950s that actually says something slightly differently. Anything that is an outcome from a perfectly competitive equilibrium you could have obtained it for a particular distribution of wealth to start with. Or put it differently, anything that's efficient, conceptually, you could have obtained it via the market from a particular distribution. So, but it also means there may be certain of these outcomes that we like. So actually, why don't we arrange then the endowments in such a way that the market will deliver that solution that we like? Actually, 1960s, this was, you know, lots of economists actually typically are a bit more leftist than you would think. And it was really the get out of jail cards for free for everybody, because actually it allowed us to talk about efficiency in the markets. But actually it separated the question of inequality and said, no, no, look, we can have the market to be efficient. It's actually maybe not the one that you like, but that has to do with inequality to start with. Okay, and that's basically the implication. As if the inequality question is something that someone should be settling, but then we can still be market economists. Okay, it was very powerful. And I want to argue that actually it's extremely powerful still in the way people think about development policy. Because what we get here, the markets lead to efficiency. So basically it's a matter of picking the distribution that we like. And then we can let the market do its job. Actually, it's a bit of, it lets the market off as well. The market isn't producing inequality. Actually, it is the initial distribution that's to blame. And that's the kind of thing. You know, we go back and we still teach our students this, but it's actually quite important. Because actually, it is actually a theory that says, well, essentially then, inequality is key. If we see poverty, it's nothing to do because of anything to do with the function of the market, but it's actually because these people didn't have good endowments, good assets to start with. Why are they poor? Because you don't have the right assets. And then you redistribute. You have to do it in a way that you don't distort the markets, but you say, you know, lump sum transfers, and people talk abstract about it, but it is about talking about redistribution. And they say, well, you know, in which countries you use the tax system, and in most countries, we'll help with aid. I will transfer wealth to you, and that's it. And actually, and we'll help you do it. Now, an awful lot of NGOs and all of the development workers, when you get their leaflets in, from an NGO in the letterbox, they seem to be thinking like this. Because actually, in a way, they say, first of all, they will debate very vigorously with you, we must focus on the poor. And measurement is key. We must know who the poor are. And then we could have, it's actually the same in economics as well, in the research on it, all the attention is about measurement. Actually, a huge part of the development literature is about measurement. Can we identify the poor? But actually, it comes a bit far, because once we know who the poor are, we'll just must make sure we target them and we'll give them the assets that they need to be non-poor. And so it becomes a measurement thing. And actually, Amartya Sen, with all his incredible writing, but it seems to be that's what he focuses on. He's concerned that actually, are we properly identifying what is poor, what does it mean to be poor, what is development here, how should we think about in all the dimensions of poverty, we can't reduce it to material things and so on. So in a bit as if the problem is not so much that the market is producing poverty, but we need to know that we talk about the right people. Actually, why I pick on Amartya is not in a sense, because it's actually really crucial, of course, that we understand some of these issues. But it was the case that actually, this is Frances Stewart actually told me that. I'm not sure she had any evidence, but it was a very good line that says, you know, 98% of the research on poverty seems to be all about just measurement. And virtually no research ended up being done about how to do it, how is poverty produced and reproduced, which is arguably the one that we should be really much more concerned with. But it also means that fighting poverty is somehow knowing who it is, and then we must make sure we can transfer and get them the right start in life or the right start in everything to do it. And then it leads somehow to some of these technocratic solutions where it's all about, you know, making sure they have the right resources. Okay, and so why do I emphasize this so much? Because I think a lot of what people in practice do seem to be driven by this. To say it's all about creating assets for poor people. Get them into school, get them the right health, get them, or, you know, even NGOs that say give them a goat, give them a cow, you know, very clear. That's the problem of poverty. It's making sure they get the assets. And that's all what we need to do. Or indeed, poor countries. The whole justification of aid, originally, when we talked about 0.7% of GNI, was we observed something that there was a gap in the kind of transfers that were needed according to the simplified model of Solow, and it was actually equivalent of 1.1% of the rich countries' GDP should flow to poor countries to allow them to start converging to the rich countries. This is the asset flow that was necessary. We observed that 0.4% of the GNI of the rich countries went via foreign direct investment. Therefore, we should add 0.7% of GNI as aid. 1965, that's how that norm came about. But it's exactly that kind of view. It's exactly that kind of very simplified way. Foreign aid as a mechanism of transfers, or indeed, those who argue, yeah, no, it's not just aid, it's all the illicit flows out of it. Reducing it similarly again to a matter of flows. It's just a matter to keep these monies there, that's all we need to do, and then everything will be fine. Again, I'm making it more simple, but it does seem to be suggesting it's a matter of resources and there. For example, it doesn't ask the question, why is not more money flowing to these places if it's such a great place to invest in? Why is money flowing out and not going there? Which is actually a slightly different question, where what is going wrong there with markets and our markets not working and so on, because according to the simplified view, this would all there. Now, it's not saying that it's a bad idea. You know, there's a nice idea, you know, people, you know, Marx said very correctly, the poor have but their labor to sell. So if we can add some assets, you know, even in the simplest model is they have already a stock of labor, we'll add some assets, the marginal return of these extra assets will be very high, a bit of health, a bit of education, a bit of capital, give them a bit of microfinance, a bit of health and so on, and they can actually work themselves out of poverty. Now, it's clearly, it makes a lot of sense. Now, of course, some people go to the extreme in that and actually say, well, that's essentially all we need to do. And this is, I don't know whether people recognize them, it's a scary picture actually. I mean, I'm sure they would have wanted to delete it from the web. But this is Bono, and this is Jeff Sachs. And Bono wrote the foreword in the book of End of Poverty, one of these books that everybody used to read. Actually, it's extremely, if you think of it, the essence is simply, and this is actually summarized at Bono, I'm sure Jeff wrote this, the introduction, I have to be careful with the live stream, yes. But you know, it's a very simplified view. The wealth of the rich world, the power of knowledge, it basically means, you know, poverty can do. It's all about flows and a bit of knowledge. Money and a bit of knowledge, that's all we need to do. Move that, know who the poor are, what a bit of there is there, make sure the money comes there, we can solve it. Or indeed, a very simple version of development, which was very prevalent in the early noughties actually, where basically said, development is simply a function of the amount of money you put in it. As if you could just put money in it and then you create development. And definitely the MDGs, people were calculating how many dollars do we need to transfer to the developing world to buy the Millennium Development Goals. Health targets, education targets, that's all we needed to do. I was actually even in my job at some point asked, can you tell us what the SDG will cost? And I bluntly refused. But the question kept on coming back, you know, it came from the permanent secretary, so you have to kind of think. So anyway, it actually made us start thinking about, look, this is such a strange way of thinking about development that you have to be careful. But it is underlying some of these processes at times. There's a chief economist for the Middle East in the World Bank who wrote a paper and did the calculations. And he says publicly all the time, this is the paper that he wishes would disappear from the web. And he's actually asked whether it could be removed, but you can't remove a paper really from the web. And it's there because there he calculates how much it would cost to actually deliver the MDGs. Very sad. There's other people that go totally against it, that say, well, maybe we can fix it, we can find things, but we have no idea how to do it. So this is Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, a whole research program that says, you know, we have no idea what we need to do. Let's now run experiments, RCTs in the field, and we're actually going to do, we can't just do this in the lazy way. Research, 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 small experiments all the time, and get lots of small solutions to doing it, which is arguably still, in the end, once we've done it, we'll put in some money, we'll get development, although we have no clue what little f is, what the function is. And we need to research it. And it's arguably talking to that same thing. Very attractive to lots of big foundations, to NGOs, this kind of work, because, you know, it gets that feeling as if you can fix it. But that's the one view. I think some of these literature, and I think it's still very prevalent in some of the language you hear used by international agencies and so on. But actually some of the better of these best-selling books definitely don't fall into that trap. They actually talk a little bit more careful about, you know, where could it be? And this is the last bit I will talk about. And I'm going to give you a flavor of the kind of way you can think about it. It's just a flavor. And it's again, this is more from the growth part. You know, where you say, well, look, the underlying big question really in lifting up countries, what we see in the evidence is that certain countries have been managing to actually move forward, where other countries seem to be risking staying behind. Can we understand some of these processes behind it? You know, and this is actually, you know, it came from the growth literature, solo model. Everybody started on trying to estimate it in cross-country growth regressions, it was called. But the big idea was really very attractive. You know, and if we believe solo, actually there is no development problem. The only problem we have is patience, because if there's convergence, if indeed poor countries will grow faster than rich countries, even though they only grow marginally faster, it's just a matter of waiting, and they will get there. So there's actually no development problem, and okay, at most, aid can actually accelerate it a little bit, but that's about what you're doing. So it's a bit of the world of Dr. Pangloss, you know, all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, and you just have to wait for a bit, a patient Dr. Pangloss, and that's all what we need somehow. There's no real issue of needing to do anything. Now, that's not clearly these people who are writing these books, because that would have been a short book. You say, look, fine, you know, convergence will happen, just wait and it will happen. That's all we need to do. And in a way, technically, it's essentially looking at, you know, this is a change in GDP per capita, and I say, well, it's linked to now whether you're poor or rich, that would be convergence, but actually people start exploring, are there factors X, are there X factors that actually somehow make us not converge or move us to another place and so on and hold us back. And this is what people ended up spending their lives on, running cross-country growth regression. I'm sure there's a few here, so, but I don't really think it was the best use of time, because people kept on throwing new variables into it and inventing new data. No, sorry, finding new data and putting it in and doing it, and all trying to unpack what is this big X. And a lot of these best-selling books actually draw to a large extent on a bit of what we learned, and it's somehow, but it's still helpful to think about it as a rhetorical device, even though as a research program I would be a little bit more problematic. It's to do that, you know, it's not so clear how you would do this properly and so on. But the way, and that's the logic, and that I will, last 5 minutes or so, I will talk a little bit more about is somehow saying, look, there may be preconditions, or there would be technically, there may be factors that make you deviate or make you hit another steady state, another outcome, something that makes you not move to where the OECD is, okay? It may make you move either slower, or indeed it may you deviate or something. And actually, this is an interesting thing. These are kind of characteristics, say, in endowments or assets, that make you forever grow slower or faster. Okay, and the forever is important, makes you diverge. And actually, this is a literature that talks about path dependence. Where you are will help you to get you, well, that's where you end up going. And then you start getting a whole series of factors. And people are saying, okay, what explains all these big differences? There's lots of stuff, endowments, or indeed assets, could make the difference, okay? So, but the real thing is that all these books then end up talking somehow about, you know, why are some countries staying behind? Well, they may well be ending up being trapped somehow into some kind of states, applying to the nation, and something to do with the endowments and assets that you have, make you stay behind with persistent effects on growth. And that's actually the idea of a poverty trap. Okay, so I'm not going to do, it's technically a bit more, but usually when we say it's about a poverty trap, it actually goes back to very careful work by, for example, Joe Stiglitz, saying somehow markets are not working. And on other people's add to it, suppose markets are not working very well, markets are failing. And then to actually go from one state to another state, you need to jump. There's some thresholds. You need to actually do something quite dramatic. That actually gets you in trouble. That's actually what you technically would need to actually get some kind of a trap. But you get a sense of a trap, because it's a bit like a cliff. It's very easy to fall down on, but it's extremely hard to climb back on. So this is something that when you're stuck somewhere, it's extremely hard to actually get out of it. And these are forms of people talking about various versions of grabs. So I'm not going to say more here. But the key feature is somewhere you're somehow trapped, and actually it seems to appeal to it. It's extremely hard to get back on that cliff. And small things won't happen. You need somehow a push, a big push. You need to have somehow being pushed out of this whole thing. And let me talk briefly about, because actually these different guys that are writing these books, and they seem to be talking about either something to do with capital, something to do with geography, and something to do with institutions. So how does this work with capital? Well, it's actually in a micro version, it's extremely easy. You know, suppose the market for credit is not working well. So the bank has no clue whether you're a good creditor or not. So what do credit markets typically do? They ask for collateral. Collateral is a way of overcoming market failure. In fact, all our credit markets fail because all the time collateral is being asked for. So, but that's an extremely simple way to actually say, of course, that means there is somehow a risk here of a poverty trap. I'm not saying it's necessarily so, but you can imagine if it's really hard to actually acquire enough capital to give us collateral to actually get a big loan. You have a really good project. If I'm poor and I don't have collateral, I can't do it. And if I'm rich, I have a lot of capital and I can actually do the project. Now, what do we get here now? What's rather important is actually we have an impact on efficiency. The market is not off the hook anymore. If you then manage to do the project, you can use all the other resources you have much more efficiently. You can do better than actually the person who can't get that complementary input going. So for example, if you need to be educated to do certain types of investments and happening to do it. Now, and if it's a real big jump to be able to get to that education, then actually those with education can do all kinds of careful investments, and those who don't, they're actually stuck. Actually, the flow and Banerjee is full of actually small ways of trying to unlock and overcome some of these little things. But why do I raise it here? Because inequality matters here now. You actually get to the situation that if I'm a poor person, I may, for example, not be able to use a modern technology because I need a little bit of, I don't know, need a bit of fertilizer for it that I need a loan for. And if I'm a rich person, I can use that technology because I can actually get the collateral to actually get that loan and actually do it. And what we get is a process of divergence. Because I actually keep on having to do a very low return as a poor person, a low return activity, not modern inputs. And me as the rich person can every year getting a higher return than this poor person, even if to start with I have the same amount, say, of land. But I actually can diverge. And that's actually the idea of poverty traps. And there's narratives. Now on the macro front, well, in a way I've already alluded to it. Because you could say, well, maybe poor countries can't get access to credit. They can't really get to borrow on international markets very well. Well, that was definitely the diagnosis initially about that's why we need to transfer resources. You know, and that would be the kind of explanation. For example, Jeff Sachs, him again, wrote papers not so long ago, actually, about 10 years ago, trying to argue, well, there's really good reasons why poor people can't save. And they can't save, therefore they can't accumulate basic assets, so they could never have the collateral to get actually credit, and therefore we need to give them the money because we need to be the ones that save for them and give them the money. So Jeff Sachs uses this as a big argument, and in the end of poverty, essentially, the argument is essentially, well, we need to transfer big amounts of money to overcome the kind of entrapment that these poor people have. It's a bit more than that. But there's other ways of being entrapped as well. You could just be stuck in a very bad neighborhood. So think of it, if I want to set up a business, should I do this? I want to do a real, fancy little app. Shall I do this in a country where people can't afford the app? Or shall I do this in a country where people can afford the app? Or indeed, where I can get a staff to actually help me run the thing, or where I can't get a staff to help me run the thing, or where I have access to all kinds of other kinds of things to do it. So actually here, neighborhoods will matter. And this is actually a very simple idea that actually where you are somehow can actually cause you to actually being permanently on a lower path of development. So if you're stuck somehow in something there, now you could say, well, it's a bit peculiar, maybe you can move. Well, maybe you can't. Or you're not allowed to. So you end up actually being stuck in localities where you can do it. Neighborhoods will matter. And actually, somehow, for example, Collier and also people like Venables here in Oxford, they use that as the narrative. They actually say, well, we can have this much more for businesses. If I want to set up a new factory, where shall I set it up? Well, let me set it up where there's already factories that actually can supply me with the labor, which I can poach, but actually they already trained these people, or near to the market where actually people can buy it, or some other form of spillover from being around with other firms. So I'll go where other things are happening, because I know it works there, it can function there, and it can do things. So you basically, the very simple way, you end up settling in industry in clusters. And agglomeration effects will matter. But actually, historically, two areas, there will have been a time that Singapore looked exactly the same as parts of Mombasa. But somehow, Singapore is not Mombasa. Once it starts going, it's very hard to actually take this firm. Why don't you go to Mombasa and say, well, why would I not go to Singapore? Because of what they call the agglomeration effects. And that's another part there. So another threshold, because late coming has a huge cost. How can you get Mombasa to be as attractive as Singapore? It will take an awful lot of effort. But you could do it also in a negative way. Maybe you need people, it's not so much because you need people or markets or whatever, or the kind of inputs that are complementary. Maybe you need to be in a people that people are not going to loot your place, that are actually, police is functioning, where crime is not very prevalent, where people trust each other. Now, again, I have this brilliant idea, but if I have to go in a place where there is very, very little trust, it's not a very good idea to actually start your business to do it, and you'll do it again in other places. So you get actually the macro versions, again, with big institutional issues, political economy things, poor institutional issues, corruption. You know, corruptions are typically equilibria. This is not because one person is bad. If I'm an honest civil servant surrounded by very bad civil servants, what incentive do I have not to be bad? I will be paid extremely badly, and nothing will change from my behavior. Or indeed, I may be pushed out by the others because I'm not playing according to the rules that they have established. So again, very hard for individuals to change it. These are, again, things you can be stuck in, traps. And this is, again, another form of macro narratives, where actually you could be stuck for all kinds of reasons, where there's persistent effects from something, somehow an endowment, something to do with geography, or something to do with assets because you don't have the capital, or you can't get access to the capital, or indeed some of the other factors. And it leads us to somehow, and I've said it already, reasons for the divergence. Now, when does it get a bit fun? Because they all say a slightly different story. And they all like to emphasize slightly different ones. But somehow, inequalities matter in different ways. The credit market one, actually inequality can actually be one of the factors that locks you into. If you have credit market failures, then poor versus rich have different access to opportunities. But similarly, there could be inequality simply in geography. This is not measured by the income or the wealth, but actually just where you are to start with. Or indeed by institutions. Inequalities in institutions could also be big drivers. Now, we probably have evidence somehow from that cross-country growth regressions, which I'm not so a fan of, as I already said. Probably all these things matter. But it's simply more than just lacking some income or some assets. It actually interacts with other conditions that you have on the ground and actually doing it. And actually to understand why this inequality between countries is still so high, we have to do it. So what do these people then say we should be doing? So if I now summarize in 2 minutes the book, each of the books, it's something, you don't need to read them anymore. They all say trade matters, I should say that, even in a world where these days that's put into question, trade still matters an awful lot. But poverty is because of market failures leading to traps. Well, definitely Jeff Sachs already emphasized that somehow these poor countries can't get access to credit. Therefore, we need to send money. He also is very clear about health externalities. They have endowed with very bad luck that there is malaria. Therefore, because there's malaria, they will be less productive. Therefore, that's an externality from geography, and therefore is another reason to give a lot of aid. Policy response, no problem. The wealth of knowledge is so big that we know what to do, no doubt. We build up the endowments and the assets, including a lot of aid and a strong focus on health. Actually, don't worry about institutions, they're fine. There's a section in the book that more or less says, no, don't worry. They'll grow out of corruption, that's not a problem. Well, look, not everybody agrees with Daron and Jim, of course, do it something quite different. They say that the X factor is institutions. Okay, I'm not going to read this thing, but essentially something about the rules and the norms in the system that somehow shape the political institutions that then actually shape the economic outcomes. And then you get, you could then get certain, groups that manage to keep also not just the political power, but also the economic power. And then you get inequality to actually repeat and reproduce the whole system. But it's not because it starts with inequality, it's something to do with norms and values and so on. Can we do anything about it? This is why it's helpful that Jim is not here, because it's an absolutely useless book, definitely for a development practitioner. It's useless because it says you can't do anything. It's history. You can't speed up history. So I've been asking Jim to write the book, tell us what to do now. You could get a prime minister in the UK that loves the book. But actually, it's simply saying, let's turn the world in the UK and everything will be well. But actually, the UK is, it's not very clear how we do this. So that's not a very helpful policy advice. And indeed, one way of reading that book is, the UK institutions are incredible. And it's a bit like, path dependence, history. Things happen. And if you're lucky, something happens, and then you can keep on doing it. And look, it's attractive. I can't deny that it's actually intellectually appealing, but from a policy point of view, it's really frustrating. So what about Bill Easterly? Well, he goes a little bit further in that. Bill will simply say, market failures, what are they? It's all political economy. It's all the politics. And actually, there's lots of failing states and institutions, and aid is to blame. We did it. We caused all these things to work very badly. So it's a very different view from what Jev and so on would say. Actually, his solution, it's quite non-interventionist. I don't know. Maybe certain politicians will find him attractive now. But it's basically let institutions grow. That's the only thing we'll do. And Western politics, the rest of the world will do well to adapt them. And everything will well. Policy response, since it's aid that create the failures, please don't. Stop with all that aid lark. We have no idea also how to do development. Stay away. You have no idea. Let's get on. Let the things get on it. And it's a little bit actually. Sometimes I summarize. We are doomed, and we will cause much more doom if we do it. Now I must say, and this is where I have to be a bit cautious because I have huge respect for the man. Angus's last chapter in his book, has somehow more or less says the same thing. And these are very simple views on what's wrong. I'm not saying they're wrong, that there are elements of what's wrong, but again, very frustrating views if you want to try to change something. But maybe, you feel attracted to it. What about Joe then, Joe Stiglitz? Well, Joe actually says not really that much wrong with countries. It's all the conspiracies internationally. It's all the failures there, Some bad experience with the IMF definitely caused some certain views, but strong failings in trade, intellectual property rights. It's quite an interesting thing because actually even now, with the context of Brexit, so many of us end up, whether we want to or not, work in government, is learning about trade again. Nobody bothered with trade because there was nothing to do. And suddenly, I'm the first chief economist in DFID who's not a trade economist, and suddenly we have to do all trade. It's quite an interesting thing because you start actually reading. Remember, there was a time that as development people, we all said it's all about trade. It's about dumping, it's about export subsidies, it's agriculture policies from Europe and so on. That was about 2000. Actually, export subsidies are essentially gone. Actually, nobody talks about it, you may have noticed that, because actually, an awful lot, by quietly, relatively speaking, all that stuff on agriculture is very little to actually see a clear impact, say, on African developing countries. And it must say it surprised me as well. But still, Joe is still talking about it. It's reform of the international system that we need to get it, and then countries will fix the whole thing. Of course, some go a little bit further. This is Hajun Chan from Cambridge. He's then actually uses Joe, full stop, but also he uses them as a kind of leftist critique on everything. And, interesting things to read about Samaritans, although there's probably very little I ever agree with on it. What about Paul then? Well, Paul is quite eclectic. Some of you will know him. There's lots of these market failures and traps, very much Africa in mind. It's a lot to do with conflict cycles. It's a lot to do with geography, so politics seems to matter. These are the kind of traps of geography and of conflict. The best predictor of whether the best predictor for civil war is whether you had a civil war in the past. These are clearly persistent, these are traps. These are self-perpetuating mechanisms. Geography matters too on poor areas. If you were unlucky to miss the boat, it's really tough to get back. And he talked very interesting on the marginalization of Africa and thing. Aid and good policy, that's the way to do it. He is a strong believer that we can do it. It's all about setting up good investment climates with lots of things, fixing conditions for growth. And he is totally confident in all his advice. So what about Esther and Abhijit? It's actually totally differently. It's so much more than micro things. Oh, well, it's all a kind of a micro level. We can find little bits and pieces. Let's find little solutions. Let's then do it. Now, they do think that it can work, but we don't really know what works. So we need to kind of try things out and be very, very careful. And definitely, if there's a big question you think is important, if you have no evidence to fix it, then don't fix it. Don't try even. Which is hard in a policy environment. You're driven by problems, and you see problems in the world, but you don't do it. And you focus on institutions, quite interesting. Focus on institution is quite interesting, is that we can do a lot of bad stuff in very good places, she says. She once said, she repeated a few times, we can do a lot of good things in really bad places. So she says, we maybe don't need to worry too much about it. I think that may be optimistic. Maybe at a micro level you can. But it's a quite, arguably a very technocratic thing, you know? We figure out what can work and then we'll do it. It's still a very strong belief that we can fix it, but it takes a bit harder to actually do it. So that's my conclusions now, since I am running over time. So, but it's very quickly here. There's different views, there's different paths to progress. They all say different things. So, you know, how real are these traps? Now, I'm not going to try to prove when one is right or wrong. But if for me, in the big picture, we do see vast poverty decline. So it's clear that not every country is being trapped. Maybe they're trapped in the middle income, which is what China and other countries are worried about. But on the extreme poverty side, a lot of progress has been happening. And indeed, some decline in inequality driven by declines in between countries' inequality. Somehow, countries moving a bit. But it's still the biggest part. My bigger worry is actually that maybe there wasn't a single narrative on traps in the past, but actually we're getting there. Because now we're getting poverty in much more messy places. Africanized poverty, it's all in Africa, but it's also much more correlated with fragile states. And a trap may well then become a much more a metaphor. So I think actually we had it quite easy to make this progress in poverty up to now. We actually had fairly easy because in the end China and India did the job for us. And arguably, they were in their ways quite stable countries that at least on the absolute poverty could make quite a lot of progress. East Asia did for us as well, and they had particular conditions, and they managed to make use of particular times in history where trade was being valued and they could do it. So the problem is that if it indeed becomes more a narrative of some of these traps, whether it is indeed something to do with being late as a geography trap, or indeed not getting access to credit markets, or indeed also not getting, or problems with political economy and institutions, this is not just overcome quickly by just a bit of transfers, especially if it's institutional stuff and geography stuff. So, but the real worry I have, finally, is that you know, that's not the narrative that people tell us on inequality at the moment. People want to say, oh no, it's about globalization that left poor people behind. I'm actually really worried that a lot of these countries that made progress, they actually, you know, managed to at least take some advantage of this globalization thing. You know, the people say it's a race to the bottom. You know, it's a good way to lift up the bottom. And actually, there's a bunch of countries, largely in Africa, that are totally untouched by all this. So if we now get to a space where that's not even possible anymore, where the attention goes away and we focus entirely on the inequality, say, in our own societies, but actually not even thinking that the biggest global inequality is the inequality between countries, then I think we're getting really in trouble. I mean, this is the developing world. It's tricky. It's not saying that we have an easy way of solving it. It's quite messy. But I worry that maybe we've been looking a little bit at some of the wrong questions. And the opportunities we have by talking about inequality, let's not lose them, that actually where the biggest inequalities are, and I still think is the inequalities between countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I'm sure if some of the authors were listening, they will now go back to, as often some of our colleagues do, revisiting the narrative. But can I ask you to perhaps just stay up here for a moment, take some questions? We have microphones, so if you have a question, please raise your arm, and then Stefan will respond. Who would like to kick off? Yes, gentleman there, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It's really very, sorry?
If you hold it closer to...
Yeah, it's really very insightful. I have two questions. The first one is on the statistic on the evolution of poverty represented by the different regions, and specifically for Africa. So we can see in these graphs that there is a huge role of like population trends or demographic there, because given that we are presenting number of poor people. So my question is, it then means that, I mean, Africa is not doing well because of the demographic context? And if that's the case, or the other countries are doing well because they've been able to do better on demographics? So what can we learn from like comparing these different continents or regions from a demographic angle or demographic policies? And also for the projection you presented, if demographic is one of the things. So maybe you may want to consider taking into account the demographic projection also in projecting what will happen to poverty.
Right.
My second question is on the second part of your presentation. You presented different views of development, different... Yeah, my second question is on the second part where you presented different views of development, different narrative, and at some point I also have a feeling that always they have been presented in opposing them one to each other. So giving the complexity of the development itself, so is it not good just at some point to consider that we need really to conciliate all of these different views and try to get something which is more like, I don't know, comprehensive assessment? Because my feeling and my opinion is that each of these views is bringing something and it's working somehow, and we cannot just focus on one single thing. So maybe how can we get a more comprehensive framework that goes together with all of these different views? Because at the end also we need to celebrate also because we're coming from very far. So we're doing the world is doing better due to all of these things. So yeah, so I want to be less pessimistic and also celebrate a bit what of each of these views has brought.
Good.
Thank you.
Should I take it or should I take more questions? So since it's two questions, let me quickly do it. Okay, so on demography, so first of all, demography is not the cause of the progress, say, in Asia or in East Asia. That would be far too simple, okay? And it's not the cause of why Africa stays behind in any sense. In fact, it's quite an interesting thing, is that even countries where we used to think that demography was leading to some Malthusian outcome, and I'm thinking here Bangladesh. You know, when I started in development, we're always studying Bangladesh because that was the case where it's all going to go wrong dramatically, the Malthusian trap. These days, its population density is actually helping it an enormous amount in its growth, you know? So it's too simple to saying keep population down, good, keep population high, terrible, or whatever. However, of course, there is something purely an accounting relationship. If I want to look at levels per capita, then, you know, I'm racing against the capitas, the heads. And so obviously it doesn't help at the moment. And so that's actually one of these things, that at the moment what's happening in growth is not helped by demography. And as a result, it probably makes then the figures looking even a bit worse. But it's definitely not in the other places the simple explanation. Do I mean then there is no issue with demography? There's something interesting happening in some parts of Western Africa. There are certain places that are not easily understood why population growth stays so high relative to the changing living standards. And there's some worries there about certain things. So there's maybe something slightly different happening with demography in the side kind of, you know, I'm definitely one of these people say the population growth will come down with development. And we still know that causality holds. But actually it may come down a little bit slower in some parts of Western Africa, it appears, than we would have expected it to do. But that's definitely on the first one. So yes, there is a demographic issue. It is already something in Africa. As a percentage of the population, they managed to bring poverty down. Of course, keeping it constant, it means as a percentage of the population, it's actually coming down. But actually, we should just not be complacent there. The other point, you know, on a more comprehensive thing, look, they like to put it as a juxtaposing, and of course I do the same thing. So, to presenting it. Look, they have very different views in terms of what's important. You know, some of them will do gladiator battles for it to actually prove that their view is stronger than another one. Actually, a lot of the institutional people, it's actually, they go against a little bit what Barry used to say, that it simply was all about investing in education. That's all we need to do, and that's in the end, I'm going to explain it all the way. But once we come to these trap explanations, I actually am with you, because of course they are actually interacting with each other, and it's sometimes hard to see, you know. am I being a latecomer because of some kind of business model and some self-perpetuating in, or is actually the fact that I stay behind has helped to actually make my institutions weaker and elites being more extractive and so on and extracting all these things. And I would simply think in Africa we definitely have a combination of they missed the boat, they have an institutional set of problems. Look, they have a financing problem, but the financing I want to actually come a bit later to, because I do worry that in some of these environments where the institutional environment is actually weak, and I don't mean corruption, but just as a kind of a place to park your money for the long run, that actually it is not just a problem of money. But I agree with you, more comprehensive, maybe slightly differently, more context specific. Go country by country, because all of these, the heterogeneity in the developing world is very striking. And I think in 30 years, we'll actually see an Africa that may well have become Twin Peaks, you know, in different ways and diverging from each other. And I think some countries at the moment are probably beginning to break away from what other countries are doing. So we'll get context-specific knowledge will become more and more important.
Thank you for the really clear presentation. I just wanted to follow up on the last point you made, which was that the between-country inequality is much more important than the within-country inequality. And whilst I understand that explains most of like the global Gini, if you want to think about it that way, over time, as you see the between-country inequality declining, if you don't tackle the within-country inequality, then poor people in poor countries still get left behind. And I think that's most clear when you kind of presented the numbers of poor people that are left in 2030, and you said the majority of them, or you know, the average person will be a Nigerian. And Nigeria is a middle-income country that's experiencing GDP per capita growth. So yes, on average, the poor countries can catch up, but if the within-country inequalities grow, then poor people still get left behind. And the second kind of point to that as well is the purpose of looking at it from an inequality perspective rather than just a poverty perspective is that we have to look at the top of the distribution too. So in a country that's growing, if the concentration of wealth at the top increases and if the growth is concentrated in the hands of the top, then that increases the power and the concentration over policies over and above just kind of the way that income is just distributed.
Okay, so very quickly is that, you know, I do agree that, you know, that we keep on having to look at it, okay? So, but it's a little bit of where of course, my emphasis wants to be is that, say, where is the bigger problem and where is the bigger picture that we may risk losing a bit. So I'm still sticking to what I said, but I don't think you fundamentally disagree with it. There is, though, something that is quite important. And this is, again, the evidence of the past. We don't know what the future will hold. But we do know that actually the relationship between growth and inequality is essentially, well, there is none. It's not so obvious that these growing countries, there is actually plenty of research, and most research would show growth doesn't lead to inequality necessarily. There's as many cases in recent history that actually it increased and it actually decreased. And of course, we don't like the ones where it increases, and then we want to look at that as well, because these are things, because there's lots of good reasons why we may not like inequality, if only for our society and for all kinds of other things, and the way people will assess themselves, and so on. So that's there. But it's not necessarily the case. Now, Nigeria is an interesting question, is that, of course, it moves into middle-income status, taking the poor with it. You know, it didn't get rid of the poor, and it actually, of course, it's a highly unequal society. The predictions are not necessarily saying that it will become more unequal, it just doesn't manage to build down the remaining stock, because the share of poverty in Nigeria will still go down, but it doesn't really manage to do it. So it does this far too slowly, and so on. Anyway, we need to look at these things, and I agree with you, and there's some good reasons for it. But the problem where I'm getting it, the causalities coming from inequality are actually more subtle. We do know that a lot of inequality is not good for growth in a country, but we don't know very well what actually does it measure best. Is it measuring the things to do with institutions, or is it just the inequality per se? Is it linked how it translates into power, or is it the inequality per se? And so on, and then we again want to be a bit careful. But there's no big disagreement there. You have to stop me.
We can continue bilaterally.
Sure.
If I may just take the point for a second, and thank you profusely for an incredible journey, and it's always enjoyable to see a whole generation of thinking being put up for review and questioning. I was just turning to Julian just now and saying, okay, I follow why you have picked the holes into all these singular theorems, so to speak, which probably you would acknowledge as well. None of them would argue it's only a matter of one thing. But I'm sort of left scratching my head at the end of the lecture and saying, okay, so what are you saying? In a way, Jeff Sachs, Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, they all had particular, let's say, foci that they pushed forward. But your last statement made me ponder. I have listened to many lectures, read many papers and articles that say that growth and inequality do not condition each other. True, but very often they actually do occur with each other. So what does this tell us? And I think when we're trying to address the issue now, not of poverty, as you say, poverty is the absolute end of inequality, but inequality in the current context, then some of the discussions that we need to face is that unless certain social, political conditions are in place, growth can exacerbate inequality, or, as you also put very interestingly, the perception of inequality, which turns into a perception of injustice. And when you say that the bottom 10 percentile, I think, in the UK are still above 73% of mean income, I think, globally. Better off than 73%. Then that's a fascinating statistic, but in the reality of the 10% here, totally irrelevant, and in the reality of the 73, also totally irrelevant. And I've been struck how maybe some of the research on growth inequality is perhaps either missing the point of what is happening around us, or needs to somehow come to grips with the fact that a society such as, Rwanda, Norway, Vietnam, have chosen different parameters within which to pursue growth and development than perhaps some of the resource-rich countries. Very interesting, just last week, a statistic came out that across the African continent, the economies that are performing worst right now in terms of economic growth are actually resource-rich countries. Now, fascinating correlation again of facts. What I take away particularly from your lecture today is there simply is no room any longer for simplistic explanations, solutions, or theories, and that we probably have to beg, steal, and borrow from many different realities in order to comprehend that. And that is, I think, one message I take away from your presentation. Each country, each society is embedded in a larger set of forces, but is also the maker of its own development pathway in the choices it makes. They may be institutionally related, governance related, values that are attached to a certain development model. And therefore, the story of growth, inequality, development, I think is one that will continue from many different directions for a while to come. But thank you very much for having taken us through what you have presented today with many, many lessons learned, some painful and others very encouraging, to go back to your point also, because there are breakthroughs that we can celebrate. Maybe we haven't understood the DNA of these breakthroughs enough yet. Final comment, the next lecture will be on the 17th of November, Urbanization, Migration and the Future Metropolis, by Professor Michael Keith, who is the director of Compass. Then on the 24th of November, again at 1700 here at the Oxford Martin School, What Influences Intergenerational Social Mobility in Europe, with Dr. Marie Paskov and Dr. Elizabeth Bucodi, or both from INET Oxford. And then I'm told that Achim Steiner also seems to think he wants to give a lecture, so that will be on the 29th of November. And I will present yet another theory about poverty, inequality, and the future, namely towards a green economy, pathways through politics, culture, and economics. That will be here on the 29th of November at 5. Stefan, thank you so much. A round of applause to you. Thank you for being with us here.